When a request comes in to an API endpoint, a very typical thing to do is check whether the request is allowed. In today's world, that often means checking if a token that is sent together with a request allows access to the endpoint. We currently don't do that. For example, let me send a request to get the itineraries, and I'm going to do that from our HTTP file in Visual Studio. So I'll have to add a subscription key, and I can just copy that over from the previous request we still have lined up here. So let me send this. This is a request to the itineraries endpoint, and we get back the 2 itineraries we have defined. So even though we secured downstream access between APIM and the underlying function, the endpoint at APIM level is still freely available. Well, not completely freely available, of course. We do need to add a subscription key, but that's not obligatory, and it is also not the best type of security. We can do better. We actually applied the same principle before. We enabled authentication for our function endpoints. We just looked into that, and we configured it by requiring a token with management.azure.com as audience value, and we applied additional restrictions. The token had to be generated by a specific client and by a specific set of identities. So that is definitely a higher level of security than just a subscription key. What we're looking for is something like WISE, but for APIs defined in APIM. What we won't find on APIM is an authentication blade. And that actually makes sense, because we don't want to enable this type of authentication for all of APIM. You want to be able to define required tokens and values inside of a token for an API, and not necessarily for all APIs together. APIM is typically not just set up for 1 or 2 APIs. It's often set up for a whole set of APIs and products that will probably require different tokens. For travel inspiration related endpoints, you may want to require a token with Travel Inspiration API as audience, for example. And for employee related endpoints, you may want to require a token with Employee API as audience, for example. The way to achieve something like this in APIM is, you guessed it, via a policy. So let's go back to our policies. And let's open the previous one we had. So this one is defined at level of all operations for the function app endpoints. As mentioned before, policies can be applied at different levels. What I want to achieve currently is that every incoming request to a travel inspiration related endpoint that goes downstream to the function app requires a valid token. I still want the search destination endpoints to be accessible via APIM without a token. So that means the correct place to add that policy snippet is here, at level of all operations of our Travel Inspiration function app endpoints API. In case you would want to check for a token when searching for destinations as well, that would mean all Travel Inspiration related endpoints require the same token, and in that case you may want to consider applying the policy at level of the product. Anyway, we are good where we are. If we open the snippets and we scroll down a bit, we see there's quite a few access restriction policies built in here. We can restrict the incoming IPs, apply rate limiting and so on, and we can validate tokens. Validate Azure AD token and validate JWT can both be used to validate incoming tokens. Seeing we are all in on Azure, our tokens will be generated by Entra ID. That used to be named Azure AD for Azure Active Directory, so we will use the validate Azure AD token policy snippet. Let me add that here. Important, we want to add that before we use the managed identity to get a token for downstream access. If the incoming request doesn't contain a valid token, we don't even want to allow downstream access. It seems that we need to input our tenant ID here and an application ID. This client ID or application ID is optional, by the way. But you should either require a certain client app ID or a certain audience or both. Otherwise, all tokens generated by Entra ID will give access, and that is not restrictive enough. We already have the client ID and tenant IDs from a previous clip. As you remember, you can get the tenant ID over on the overview blade of Entra ID. So let me copy and paste that in here already. As far as the application ID is concerned, well, in this specific case, that is the Azure CLI object ID, as we are testing with tokens that are generated via the CLI. We used that one in the previous section as well. But if you don't remember that anymore, you can find all of Microsoft's built-in application IDs via the link on screen, including Azure CLIs. I'm going to paste that one in here, and there we go. Let's already save this and give this a try. All right, back to Visual Studio. We've got that request lined up here still. We used to have access. We used to get back a 200 OK. So let's send it again now. And now we get back a 401 unauthorized. That's already looking a bit better. Now let's see if we get access again if we pass through a valid token. And we still remember how to generate that. I've opened PowerShell and I've logged in. So let's call into AZ account get access token to get an access token. All right, let's copy this one and let's pass it as bearer token via the authorization header. All right, let's send that request again. And there we go. As you can see, we again have access. So this works just fine. However, I would like to improve on this a little bit more. I'd like to have an additional audience restriction, which is used to check if this token was effectively intended for this endpoint. In other words, if this endpoint is the intended audience for the token. Otherwise, any token generated by the Azure CLI by our current tenant would allow access to these endpoints. I only want specific tokens to grant access. Now, we could go ahead and create custom scopes, but for the demo, I'm going to use one of the built-in scopes. The rest would lead us too far, and we don't need that for me to be able to show you how to restrict the audience. So let's restrict the audience to something we already know is supported by resources on Azure, and that is the management.azure.com audience. All right. To pass through a restriction, we use the audiences tag, and inside of it, the audience tag. And I pass through the audience we want to require, which is management.azure.com. All right, let's save this. And let me try sending our old request again. This one no longer gives access. Makes sense because that token doesn't contain the audience we're now validating. Let's get a new access token, this time with the audience in it. All right. Let's copy the token and let's use it when sending our request. There we go. And we again have access. There's a few more options you can set when using this policy, and you can find all of them, as you can expect, in Microsoft's documentation. As you can see, there's quite a few things you can check for. But what if you're not using Entra ID, but another identity provider like Okta, Duendi Identity Server, or something along those lines? Well, that is what the generic validate JWT snippet is for. You can use this to validate tokens from any identity provider, including Entra ID, but also all the other ones I just mentioned. And with that, we know how to secure incoming requests with tokens. Up next, let's look into how we can harden downstream access with IP restrictions. We still have an issue. Our app service endpoints are still free for all. By that I mean getting the destinations. And that is more or less okay, seeing we want searching for destinations to be freely available. But what I don't want is users to access those endpoints via the app service itself. I only want to allow access via APIM, as that would allow us to put rewrite policies, rate limiting policies, and things like that in place when needed. So, what I don't want to allow anymore is this request, a GET request to the app service directly. I do still want to allow GET requests to this endpoint via APIM. So, how do we do this? Well, it would obviously be a good idea to also require a token downstream at level of the app service endpoints and use a managed identity from APIM to get a token to access that app service endpoint. But that is exactly what we did with the function endpoints. I would definitely advise you to do this for the app service endpoints as well, but I'm not going to do it, as it would simply be a repetition of what we just did and what we've actually done a few times by now already. However, there is another thing I would advise you to do in this case: IP restrictions. We can ensure that only APIM is allowed to call the app service endpoints. For that, we need APIM's IP. We can find that via the overview blade. Let's copy that to the clipboard, and then let's navigate to our app service. And let's navigate to the networking tab. Here we can configure a few rules for inbound traffic. Let's click that here. And let's say we only want to allow public access from selected networks. So what I want to do is add an allow rule from APIM's public IP address. I need to give it a priority. Rules are evaluated in order of priority, so if you add multiple rules, this is a field to keep in mind. Let's put it at 100, and let's click Add Rule here. And let's click Save. All right, I'm agreeing to update the access restrictions. Now let's try sending the request to get the destinations directly from the app service again. That doesn't work anymore. So far, so good. Now let's try accessing it via APIM. We've still got that request lined up here from a previous demo. Let's send it. Oh, I forgot that I, of course, changed the URL here. We're now using that rewrite policy, so the public URL is cleaner. Let's send it again. And there we go. That is still allowed. We could now go ahead and do the same thing for the function app endpoints, but that too would just be repetition. So this is how you secure these things. Managed identities downstream, typically combined with IP restrictions, so the downstream endpoints are not directly accessible. At level of the APIM endpoints themselves, requiring a token is the advised way to go if you don't want to allow everyone access. And that can then optionally be combined with a subscription key.